Let's do the patch pocket next. This is a very common pocket. You see this a lot on denim. You'll need the patch pocket garment pattern, cut 1 from muslin, and the spade pocket pattern, cut 1 from contrast fabric. Included in your sample book patterns will be a rounded patch pocket pattern. That is for your reference. We'll be doing the spade patch pocket for our demo book, or a sample book. Make sure you clip your notches and copy your internal lines to your spade patch pocket, and do make sure you're cutting it from a fabric that contrasts from your muslin. We're going to work with the pocket first before we move it onto the garment pattern. We're going to take care of the top edge of our pocket. Down here at the bottom is where our point is. The top edge is the nice flat edge. And I want to clean finish this top edge. What I want you to do, take your fabric and flip it right side down. So again, if you've got fabric that doesn't have a right or wrong side, just pick whichever side you like the least and have that facing up towards you. And this edge, where it's nice and clean finished, turn up 1/4 inch. Practice eyeballing 1/4 inch. If you're not too sure, use your ruler and fold up 1/4 inch. So wrong sides together at 1/4 inch. That's 2 little squares on the ruler. Just give this a little bit of a finger press to begin with, so you have this in place. And then take this to the iron and iron this edge flat. So now I've got my 1/4 inch fold pressed into place. Here's how it looks from the right side. Nice clean folded edge. And from the wrong side, 1/4 inch folded, wrong sides together, pressed into place. I'll go back to the right side of my pocket, and where your notches are on either side, you should have notches on either side. Those are placed at 1 inch below the cut edge of your fabric. Now we've just reduced 1/4 inch by folding this, so now we have 3/4 inch left. With the right side of your fabric facing up, fold the top edge of your pocket right sides together. And where those notches are is right where your fold should be. So your notches should be sitting right along that fold. Otherwise our pocket will end up a little too short. I've got my notches right on those folds here. And again, I'm going to finger press this in place. It's a little bit easier upside down. Finger press into place. So you should have 1/4 inch folded with the right side facing up, and then 3/4 inch from our new folded edge to our original edge right under here. Finger press this in place right where those notches are, and then grab some pins and pin this in place. So you've got a little bit of an accordion going on here. It's folded down and then another 1/4 inch folded up, making sure that notch is in the right place. Going to pin from the raw edge. I'm going to be sewing at a 1/2 inch seam allowance right along this raw edge, and I just want to make sure that this 1/4 inch doesn't get lost, so I'm putting 2 pins in place. Same thing over here, making sure that is aligned properly, and placing 2 pins perpendicular to my stitch line. And just in case, I will mark my 1/2 inch seam allowance. You can use the seam guides on your machine, or give yourself guidelines to follow with a friction pen. So that's ready. These are pinned all the way through. I'm going to head to my sewing machine and I'm going to stitch just along these little edges, just the pieces that I folded. I'm not going to continue down the rest of the pocket, just these edges that I folded, back tacking at the beginning and then back tacking at the end. Again, back tacking at the beginning and then back tacking at the end here. So there is my stitching. Still have my fold intact and that's locked down by the stitching. Now what I want to do is turn this right side out. And you can see I can tuck this extra seam allowance up and underneath there. But if I'm working with a heavyweight fabric, even working with this fabric as thin as it is, there's a lot of bulk going on down inside there. A lot of seam allowance getting pushed into place as I turn those corners right side out. So I want to reduce the amount of seam allowance that I have to contend with here. And to do that, I'm going to cut away some of my seam allowance fabric. I'm going to do what's called clipping my corners. I have a corner here that I've created. Between this fold and my stitching line. And I'm going to clip into this corner. I'm going to reduce the amount of seam allowance out here to the edge. I currently have a 1/2 inch of seam allowance. I'm going to reduce it to about 1/8 of an inch of seam allowance. I'm going to use some tiny scissors so it's a little easier to see. You can use any scissors you'd like. I'm going to cut this at a 45-degree angle, trimming just enough so that I have about 1/8 of an inch of fabric between where my stitching is and the rest of my seam allowance here. I'll show you that again on the other side. I'll do the same thing here. Where my corner, my fold, and my seam line is, I'm going to clip and reduce the amount of seam allowance in this area. So again, cutting at about a 45-degree angle, clipping that corner, and leaving about 1/4 of an inch, 1/8 of an inch between my stitching line and what's left of my seam allowance there. So that's going to help reduce a lot of bulk for me by clipping those corners. These little pieces we can get rid of. And now I'm going to head to my iron and start getting this pressed into place. Now to ensure that I've got a nice clean press finish on the outside, I want to press these seams open to begin with on either side here. And to do that, I'm going to employ my tailor's board again, and I'm going to get my tailor's point. See if I can get this into the shot here. Here is my pocket sample with my 2 lines of stitching. Going to open up one of the lines of stitching and fit my tailor's point just inside of there. And that way I'll have my stitching line laid right there, and I can open up the seam allowance right at that point and press this seam allowance open just a bit to get that set into place. Same thing over here. The rest of my seam allowance, I'm going to lift this up, slide the point of my tailor's board in there. And now my tailor's board is right there at that point. I can open up this seam allowance and press this flat. and make sure that my seam is right there on that fold. Okay. Now that that's nice and pressed, I'm going to, here's my seam allowance. There's the rest of my pocket. That's what it looked like here. I'm going to set my thumb up inside of here and pinch with my finger from either side. There's my seam allowance. There's my corner that I need to turn. I'm going to push my pointer finger in the opposite direction. I'm just twisting my fingers in the opposite direction and pushing that seam allowance inside of my garment. And now I've got a nice clean finished corner on both sides. I'll show you that again. Here's the original stitching that I had and the seam pressed open. I'm going to place my thumb, I'll do this with my left hand, place my thumb inside the corner that I want to turn, pinch my seam allowance with my finger, and then just trade places, push my pointer finger inside and pull my thumb outside and get those corners nice and crisp. Now if you find that the corners don't want to poke out, maybe they're a little bit tucked in, they're looking a little bit like this, tucked in, they don't want to come out, grab a sharp pointy object, the tip of your scissors, and just be very, very careful that you're not forcing this. So if I've got a corner that doesn't look very straight, it's kind of tucked in there, and take a sharp object, place that underneath my fabric, and push that corner out from the inside. Be very careful doing this. You don't want to poke holes in your fabric. You don't want to poke holes through your stitching, but you can use a nice sharp object to point out that corner. I'll do the same over here. Placing my awl inside and just poking that fabric up and out to make sure I have a nice crisp corner. I'm liking how this is looking. Here it is from the right side of my pocket and from the wrong side of my pocket. That's why we placed that 1/4 inch fold. Now it's nice and clean finished on the inside. I'm going to press this into place so that I can set this top fold. Okay, so that's the inside of my pocket, nice and pressed. There's the outside. Now I've got the rest of my pocket just hanging out, hanging open here, and I want to press down 1/2 inch. There's a 1/2 inch seam allowance on our pattern, all the way around the rest of the edges. So I want to press that down so it's nice and clean finish from the outside. And there's a few ways to do that. You can utilize your internal lines. If you copied your internal lines with friction pen or chalk or something, you can use those to your advantage. You can use your ruler to ensure that you are folding in a 1/2 inch. I'll show you another little doohickey that you do not have to have, but if seamstressing or tailoring becomes something you do pretty often, this is a pressing aid by the Clover brand. It's got sharp corners, it's got curved corners, it's got inward corners, and it's got guidelines on it in imperial measurements, so I can see where a 1/2 inch is. And I can place this at my fold where I want it to be folded. I can fold my fabric on top of it and then press this into place. It's very good for pressing under pockets and hems and things like that. But again, this is not necessary, not at all. Just another doodad that I like to collect. I'll do the same over here. Place this at my fold line. Press this on top. You can also use, I've seen some ateliers use just a piece of thin cardstock. Instead of having a fancy tool like this, like a little bit of thin cardstock to place underneath there. This is another guide for pressing. I'll get these final two, the points at the bottom, taken care of. Same thing, going to place this along my fold line. I have it marked with friction pen and chalk, so I can see that. I can fold this up, press it into place. And once more. Okay. Just give it one more final hit with the iron to make sure everything's laying down as flat as can be. Make sure those creases are pressed in really well. And now it looks much nicer from the front side of our pocket. I'm going to head back to the work table and we're going to do some hand stitching. I'm going to get a contrast thread. So the first thing I want to do is lock down all of these little 1/2 inch folds that I made. I don't want these going anywhere while I'm on the sewing machine trying to stitch this down. So I've got a needle and some white thread just so it's contrasting to my red fabric here. I'm going to sew this from the right side because when I go to remove these stitches, these are just hand basting stitches to hold everything in place. I want to be able to access my knot from the right side of my sample. I don't want the knot to get stuck underneath here where my stitches are going to be. To hold down these folds, I'm not worried about what's going on up here because that's already machine stitched. I'm worried about everything below that. So I'm going to place my needle just below that line, somewhere near the middle, about 1/4 inch away from the edge. And again, I'm going to pull that through. That way my knot is anchored on the right side of my sample, of my pocket. And then I'll just do a running stitch all the way around the edge, making sure I lock down all of these little corners so they don't get in my way while I am machine stitching, because we will be top stitching this pocket into place. Remember to take relatively small stitches, no more than 3/8 of an inch long. Anything longer than 3/8 to 1/2 inch long basting stitches don't really do much. If at any point you feel like you want to reinforce the corners even more, you can take a second stitch over them. They'll just be a little more difficult to rip out afterwards. Okay, again, I'm not worried about what's going on at this top edge. I'm just going to bring my thread to the front of my work, the right side of my work, and I'll just snip this off, leaving a little bit of a tail, so I know where to find that when I go to take these stitches out. We're almost ready to get this positioned on our garment, but we got this little guy to deal with. We don't want anybody putting their hand inside of this pocket and maybe they pull out some change and then it gets stuck underneath here. So we need to lock this down. There's several ways that you can do so. You can top stitch, machine top stitch across all of this. You have to be very careful when doing so. If you're going to top stitch this, do not back tack. Leave tails on either end. And then you can tuck the tails up inside of the pocket when you go to stitch it into place. I am going to hand stitch it. I'm just going to keep my same thread that I have here, and I'm going to do a slip stitch because we have a nice folded edge here that we can use to our advantage. So I'm going to slip stitch mine into place. I like to work from right to left when I'm slip stitching, so I'm going to anchor my knot over here. Obviously, if you were doing this, you'd be using a thread that matches your garment fabric. And again, tiny stitches, and then passing them through the fold. So recall the hem finish sample. Those stitches we did for the hems are not just for hems. I'm going to be using those stitches for a lot of uses. I want to make sure this doesn't dip on me, so I'm going to pin this. Just be careful when you're pinning. Make sure you're using sharp pins so you don't poke holes in your fabric. A sharp pin will kind of slide its way through the fibers of your fabric without leaving holes or tears. As I get to the end of my work here, I'm just going to take a couple of tiny stitches, make my little knot. Oops. And just as we did on the hem finish, I'm going to tuck my needle inside my extra fabric. It's not coming out of the other side, it's just sliding in between there. Bring it out a little bit away from where I went in to my fabric. Give that a tug. Clip that thread and let it slide back inside. Make sure you keep your work flat as you go. So I can get that. There are my tiny little slip stitches in there. From the right side, there's a couple of teeny tiny little stitches. If I were using red thread, you probably wouldn't see them. Top stitching can be quick, but this is much less noticeable than top stitching, so you may consider doing this. You're welcome to do whichever. You can do a top stitch, a machine top stitch, but as I mentioned, make sure you're stitching from this side, the wrong side of your fabric, so you can get a 1/16 of an inch. Line up the fold of the fabric just along the inner edge of one of your presser foot toes, just like we did for the top stitch hem, the dungaree hem. Leave tails at the beginning and at the end, and then you can tie little knots, like 1 or 2 square knots, into those threads to hold them in place, and then tuck the excess threads up underneath when we go to top stitch this to the garment. But you can also do a slip stitch as well. I prefer the slip stitch. I think it looks a little bit cleaner, but a top stitch is pretty standard if you're working with denim, obviously. Now let's get the pocket garment cut from muslin. So this emulates your garment. Could be a pair of pants, could be a skirt, could be a t-shirt. It's just a rectangle of fabric, no identifying marks of any kind. This can be one of the most difficult aspects of working with a patch pocket, is where do we position it? Do we angle it, make it straight, put it upside down? It's totally up to you. But for our sample book, we're going to keep this upright, and we want to center it on our work here. This pocket is 5 inches wide once it's finished. Mine's a little bit shy just because fabric, you know. On paper it's 5 inches, but on the fabric here it's about 1/8 of an inch shy of that. But I can measure in, I'm going to use my friction pen so my marks will erase. I'm going to measure in 1/2 inch on either side of my rectangle. I'm going to position my pocket between those two lines, and I just want to center it vertically on my sample here. It doesn't have to be perfect. Do your best to eyeball where that's going to go. And then I'll see how tall this is. It's about 2 inches from the top, 1.5 inches from the bottom. So let's call that 2 inches from the top. This is going to be important to note when you're working with, if you intend to put patch pockets onto your skirt later on. It's knowing where am I going to position this, and is it going to be angled straight when I place this onto my garment. Most of the time you will have marks, tailor's tacks on your actual garment pattern. But when you're working on your skirt, you're going to need to put the skirt together first before you can figure out where you're going to place the patch pockets. And then you've got to mark your fabric either with chalk or tailor's tacks or friction pen so that you can ensure that your pockets are laying in the orientation that you want. I measured 2 inches down from either side and made a couple little marks for myself so I know that's where the corners of my pocket should go. And I'm going to go ahead and start pinning this into place all the way through the pocket and my garment fabric, my muslin. Just want to hold those corners in place for right now. I'll go ahead and pin down the sides. And at this point, if you had top stitched your top edge, this is where you would tuck those tails in. You know, you'd have 2 tails hanging out from either side, put little knots in them, and then tuck the excess down inside, and then you can trim those from inside the pocket later. I'm going to zoom in here because before we go onto the sewing machine, I want to identify what we're going to be doing here on the corners of our pockets. We're going to start from one corner. We're going to make a reinforcing stitch in one corner, go top stitch close to the edge, about 1/16 of an inch away from the edge, all the way down, pivot in this corner. Again, 1/16 of an inch from the edge, top stitching till we pivot again, top stitching all the way around, pivot, come up the other side, and then we will finish off with another reinforcing stitch here. It's important to reinforce the stitches up here because these are high stress points where people are pulling on the pocket, pulling on the pocket. You may have seen that happen on your denim sometimes where it wears down in this corner and then this whole thing starts to come loose. So we're going to reinforce these stitches, and to do that, I'm going to place some markers for myself. I'm going to use my ruler, and I want to identify 1/8 of an inch on my ruler. That's one of the tiny squares. 1/8 of an inch. I want to identify that 1/8 of an inch line on my ruler. And I'm going to place that line on the edge of my work. So the edge of my pocket has that 1/8 of an inch line on it. I'm going to make a mark using this edge of my ruler, 1/8 of an inch in. I'll do the same over here. Let me just pin this. So there's my mark, 1/8 of an inch in from that edge. I know my top stitching is going to be about 1/16 of an inch from the top edge and from the rightmost edge. So I'm just going to make a little horizontal line about 1/16 of an inch away from there. I'm going to start giving myself a little bit of a mark for where my top stitching will go along my rightmost edge. So there is my 1/8 of an inch mark. There's my top edge right there. Started drawing a little bit down this edge here just to identify where that's going. Now I want to feel under my fabric, I can feel that ridge right here where my fold of my top edge of my pocket, right there. I can feel that under my fabric. And I want to make a little bit of a mark right at the bottom of that edge. So I know here is where the fold of my fabric is, somewhere in that general vicinity. And I'm going to join this little cross mark I'm going to join this little cross mark down here where that fold is to this point up here, 1/8 of an inch away from the raw edge, from the folded edge of my pocket. So from here up to here. It's going to create a slightly diagonal line. But it's going to help me to reinforce this. So when I get to my sewing machine, I'm going to start here in this corner, right where my fold is on the underside. I'm going to stitch up at a bit of a diagonal into this point here. I'm going to pivot into this corner, and then I'm going to come down this edge. So I'm creating a triangle here. I'm going to do the same over here. I'm going to mark the same over here. Find where my fold is, put a little cross mark there. Measure in 1/8 of an inch, maybe a hefty 1/8 of an inch. Then I know where my top stitching is going to go along my edges. And then from where I've marked my fold up to that 1/8 of an inch mark at the top edge of my pocket, I'm going to join those with a diagonal line. So again, it's a bit of a triangle. When I get around to this side, I'm going to be top stitching along this edge. I'll top stitch right along that edge, pivot in this corner, stitch about 1/8 of an inch over, pivot again, and come back down to where my fold is, right down there. So again, I'm creating this little triangular shape. Same thing over here. It's going to start here, go up and in about 1/8 of an inch, pivot in the corner, and come back down. So let's head to the machine and get this stitched into place. So here's my rightmost edge of my pocket. I'm going to start on this edge, starting right here at this point here where the fold of my fabric, this little edge, I can feel that right about there. So I'm going to put my needle down here and I'm going to stitch up in this direction. So let me turn my fabric around. So we have been laying it flat on the table like this. I'm going to turn this upside down. Place my work in there and start right there in that tiny little, that dot right there. Lowering my needle right there. I am going to back stitch And remember, I'm not going straight up this edge. I'm going to come in over here ever so slightly. So I'm going to angle my work just a little bit so I can stitch at a bit of an angle. 2 stitches forward, 2 stitches back. I'm going to walk my stitches as I get right up here to that edge. If I take one more stitch, I'm probably going to stitch off the edge of my pocket, so that's going to be fine. Make sure your needle is down in your work, lift your presser foot, pivot your work so we can go out to the corner. That's probably going to be 1 stitch, so I'm just going to walk that 1 stitch, just barely catching the edge of my pocket. You can kind of hold your fabric if you find that your needle's going to go off of your fabric. Just hold it in place. You know, the feed dogs are going to pull your fabric. You can counteract the feed dogs. That's totally fine. Just want to make sure I've got my threads. That's where I started. Went at an angle, pivoted. Now I'm in the corner. Needle down, lifting my foot, pivoting again. Now I'm going to top stitch all the way down the edge, keeping this folded edge of my pocket right up along the inner edge of this rightmost foot, right along here. And I'll top stitch my way down. I'm approaching my first corner. I'm going to walk my stitches. Again, I might have to manipulate the fabric just to get it as close to that corner as I can to still stay on my pocket. Needle down, presser foot up, pivot, and continue on. And again, walking my stitches, doing my best to keep on the pocket. There we go, it's about as close as I can get without stitching off. Needle down, presser foot up, pivot, and keep going. One more stitch. I'm going to kind of hold my fabric so it doesn't feed too much. There we go. Needle down, presser foot up, pivot, and up the last side. Coming up the last end here. I'm going to keep on stitching, coming up around this edge, getting all the way to this corner, and then I'll pivot again. One more stitch. I'm going to kind of hold my fabric, make sure I don't stitch off. There we go. Right in there. Needle down, presser foot up, pivot. I'm going to take about 1 stitch in this direction. Just walk 1 stitch. That should be fine. Needle down, presser foot up. And now I'm going to stitch along that diagonal and get myself back down to this little point. I've got this marked on my fabric, right where that fold is. And once I've reached that point, I should intersect my top stitching that I had right along here. And then I will back stitch 2 stitches back, 2 stitches forward, and take up lever all the way up, lift my presser foot, remove my work. I'm going to leave some tails on my thread. I want to do a nice clean finish on these. I'm going to finish these off similarly to how we did the zippers. So I'm going to head back to my workstation. You can see that my bobbin thread needs a little bit of tightening up. We started here, went up at an angle, pivoted, came into the corner, and then stitched all the way down, all the way around. And then we came back to here, pivot in this corner, and then came back around. So it creates these little triangular stitches. You might be able to see it from the bobbin side. That act as extra reinforcement in those corners. Back over here, just as we did with our zippers, on the back of my sample, I'm going to find my bobbin thread. I'm going to tug on my bobbin thread, and you should see a little loop of thread come up. I'm going to grab that with my awl. I've got a needle here. Pull that top thread, that little loop of thread, up into the back side of my sample. If I can. There we go. And now I can tie these two threads in some square knots. I'll do the same over here, see if I can pull up a loop on this side. Got my bobbin thread. There it is, pops right through. And there I go. And I've got both sets of threads on the wrong side. No one would see any thread tails or any bits of thread on the right hand side. I'm going to tie 2 or 3 square knots with each of these. And then clip my threads. Just leave a tiny tail on those. Excuse my iron. I think it's coming to the end of its days. Little knots with tiny little tails. I can remove my basting stitches. I can put this on the iron and press it so I can get rid of all of my marks. I'm going to label this. If we want to be particular. Spade patch pocket rather than a rounded patch pocket. Pick out my basting stitches. Got to my iron to get rid of my marks. And there is our spade patch pocket. You can stick things inside of there. And now we've got the patch pocket.